Hi, Rachel and Sally. How are you all?
Hi, Annabelle.
How's it going?
Hi.
Okay.
Good. So we'll give this another minute or two and then we can get started. Hi, Kristen. Welcome.
Hello.
How are you? Okay. Ready. Just going to give it another 30 seconds or so just to make sure, see if we get some more people. Welcome, Micah. How are you?
Hi.
How are you?
It's Mika.
Oh, Mika, sorry.
It's okay.
All right. Let's just go ahead and dive in then. So today we're starting a new, or I guess I'm starting a new live build. So this will pretty much be a walkthrough of the final project, how it looks getting started. And the point of this is not to give you a project to replicate, but of course you will probably, a lot of things can be reused, and some of these like concepts and ideas you will be using in your project. But make sure if you do see anything that is new to you, that you don't implement it in your project unless you understand what's going on, because well, obviously you want to be writing something that's your own and that you understand and that you can explain. Because when you get to your assessment, in your questioned on your application, you're gonna get questions about those things, and it's good to know what you're doing. And also this project, we may not complete the whole project build. It might not meet every requirement of the final project, but it will be the general idea, and hopefully will make everyone more comfortable with how everything is working. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. This is okay. This is not very interesting. This is not my forte, setting up stuff like this. But basically the application that we're going to work on, it's going to be extremely simple. Something that I've noticed is a lot of people make these final projects really complicated, which is fine, of course, but there's nothing wrong with making a really simple application, and there's no need to get carried away with trying to make your application something insane. You can always add on to your project later. It's good to start simple. So what we're going to do is just a very simple application where you have accounts. You can make multiple accounts, and then you can make transactions. So you'll have a balance, your account would have a balance, and you can deposit money or withdraw money, and that'll all be saved in your database. It's going to be very, very simple. So this is kind of the structure of the React application. Probably have some sort of homepage, a link to an accounts index page. That would be a page that has links to all of your accounts. If you then click one of those links and you go to a specific account page, you would see links to specific transactions, and you can. There also will be a new transaction form, and you also have a new accounts form. So it's going to be very, very simple, a basic CRUD application. hopefully we will be incorporating all the create, update, and delete actions, because those are good to include. Any questions before we get started? No? Okay. So all I've done so far is create a folder right here. It's empty. That we're going to be putting both our Rails application and our React application in here. So let's start with creating our Rails directory. Anyone remember how I'm going to get started with that? To create a new Rails application. Okay. No, it's hard. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, isn't it Rails?
Yep, Rails new. Is that what you said?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. My thing cut out for a second. Okay, yep. So we can do Rails new. This is going to be our backend, so I'm just going to call it expenses backend. So this is kind of a throwback. I know once you get into React and Redux, it's very easy to kind of forget what you learned in all the Rails sections. So it's a good refresher. But really what we're doing is creating a Rails backend and a React front end. They're completely separate applications. They will be interacting with one another, but they are separate. So the first thing we need to do is create a Rails application. And I'm going to throw in this API flag. What that really just does is tell our application it's just going to be an API, just prevents some extra gems and dependencies and stuff from being created that we won't need. So I'm going to go ahead and run this. Great. So now when I type in ls, I can see that I have an expenses backend. So I'm going to cd into that and open up that backend. Okay. So all this really did, well, it did a lot. It generated this whole application. It set up everything we're going to be using, controllers, models folder, our database folder, all these different things we're going to be using for our setting up our Rails backend. So the main thing in this part of our application in the back end is obviously our database will be holding all of our data. That data we will then be accessing from our React application. And we will be controlling those interactions in our controllers. And we're going to have to also set up some routes in here. And those routes will be for when we make our fetch requests to get data from the front end. These are the routes that we'll be making those requests to. Okay, so really all I've done so far is create a Rails application and given it a name. I'm gonna go ahead and come back into this main folder and we're gonna start with the back end and getting that all set up, but might as well run our command to start our React application as well. So what command is that going to be? Anyone?
Create React app.
Exactly. So this is actually a requirement of the final project that you use create React app. It is actually something you probably would want to use anyway. It makes it extremely easy for us. So expenses front end. This sometimes takes a while, but this will generate our React application and set up all those folders and files that we're going to be working with. Okay. In the meantime, let's go on over to GitHub, because we're going to want to make sure that our code is on GitHub so that we can, we know it's stored there and we can make our commits and have everything there. So, we're going to create a new repository for each of these. Okay. So this finished. I'm going to just open this up, just so that we can get both of these pushed up to GitHub and not have to worry about doing that later. So this really just set up the bare bones of what we're going to be using. I'm going to get rid of all of these extra folders, files. I don't like to have them there. That's just me. Just going to get rid of all of this stuff. And I like my app to be a class component. We're going to get into this later, but I'm just going to get this set up, and then we're going to need a render. Okay, we will go over all of this later. Just going to get this set up for our initial commit. And our index, I got rid of that, I got rid of that, and I got rid of this. Okay, cool. So we have our two applications set up. Just a reminder, they are completely separate applications. They will be interacting, but they are not the same. Okay, so I'm going to, I went to GitHub, created a new repository, just like you've done every time. I'm going to call the first one expenses backend. Just matches this name. It's easy. Okay. It's going to be public, and I'm going to create it. So you've done this before, most likely. Since I already created the directory here, but I haven't added it to this GitHub repository, I'm going to have to run all of these commands. So I'm initializing this repository. Is there a README? There's already a README here, so I'm going to, instead of doing git add README, I'm going to do git add period, which will add every single file and folder in here. And then I'm going to just follow these. You can paste them all at once. So I just committed those. And now I'm just going to paste these. Enter your password. Great. So you can literally copy and paste all of these. It's probably old news. You've done it before, but just a reminder. So now when I go here, beautiful. We see everything. We see I have one commit, first commit. Great. So now we're just going to do the same thing for the front end. So this is called expenses front end. Oops, I always do that. So same thing, git init, git add. And that's all set up. So something I want to point out is that in this article, which is posted on the project page on Learn, this article will walk you through these steps. It's great. You should read the whole thing, absolutely. But when you're following along, you really want to start following along down here when you see the server. And then you're going to be doing option 2. You're creating a new Rails application. This is exactly the command I ran, except I obviously named it something different. And this reminds you, you're going to have to set up all of these things. So this, when it says copy over, this is assuming that you're trying to use the API that they've already set up. You will obviously be creating all of your own models, your own controllers, your own routes, your own migrations to set up your database. But once you've done that and run migrate, then you can test your server, make sure it's working. Then this article here talks about incorporating Create React App. So what this article tells you to do is set up your React application within your Rails directory. So what this is doing is, instead of having them in separate directories like I do here, you would have a folder at the top level of this called a client, and it would hold all of this in there. So that's the way this article does it, but you can absolutely do it this way and set up your React application in a completely separate directory and repository on GitHub. It's totally up to you. Even if you have your React application inside your Rails directory, remember it's still a separate application. It does not mean that they're the same. It doesn't really make a difference. The one thing about doing them separately is, first of all, it's a reminder that they're separate applications. And also, if you decided that you wanted to use your backend, your API for a different project, you could absolutely reuse it, create a different front-end application. And you could do that even if you had this inside of your Rails directory, but it's nice to have it then removed, and then you can create as many front-end applications as you want using this API.
And well, do you have as the parent level just expenses application, and then these are each subfolders?
Yep, so let's see. Let's go here. So I have a live builds folder. When I type in ls, we see an expenses application directory. When I cd into here, I now have the back end and the front end, which is these top levels that we're seeing there, back end and.
Okay, but you just open them in separate windows and add them.
Right, so they're in, exactly, yes, you could totally open them in the same. This is just personal preference. I think it gets messy when you have too much going on. Yes, so you could still open them within the same, within one Atom window. And this is all, again, up to you. This is just how I wanted to structure it. I think it's nice to have a directory that holds the two applications within it, and then these in their own separate directories. But again, you could do the front end within the Rails directory. That's up to you. Okay. So yeah, this is personal preference. It's up to you. You can do it either way. It's gonna work the same. Okay. So we have 2 commits here. Oh, okay, so this automatically did a first commit. Cool. Okay, so we have those pushed to GitHub, which is great. And for now, we're gonna take a pause on the front end. I think it makes sense to get your back end set up. Helps you get a better feel for what you're trying to create. And that's just the way I am choosing to do it. And I think that's probably the best way to understand what your front end is going to look like, because your front end is going to be rendering data from your back end. Okay. So where am I? Okay. I'm going to create a notes file that we can work from, just to get some ideas about how we're going to want to set up this application. Okay, so as I said, we're going to have an account. and transactions. Account model and transaction models. So when this is fully functioning, the goal is that you can have multiple accounts and accounts will have different transactions. We are not going to do a user model for this live build. Users are not required for this final project, and it's great if you want them, but it's also totally fine not to have them. I know Howard just finished his Globetrotter live build, and he had users there, so if you want to get some info on that, that would be a great resource to use too. But I want to show how simple we can keep this application while still meeting the final requirements. Okay, so what would the relationship be between an account and a transaction? What do we think that would be?
An account has many transactions.
Yep. Okay, and so what does that mean for a transaction?
Transaction belongs to an account.
Okay. So these are the relationships we're going to be setting up. What about the attributes for an account? Obviously, there are a couple, you could add a bunch of different ones, but what do we think the important things that an account will need? When you think about your bank account, what do we see there? Oops. Sorry, I'm always messing up. Yep, a balance. That's a great one. So a balance attribute. That would be, we could do this totally with just a balance. I was thinking maybe add a name. It could be a checking account, a savings account, whatever. Just to add something else here, it'll make it a little prettier on the front end when we're rendering data for an account. Okay, great. So an account will have a balance and a name. What data types do we think these should be? What would make sense?
A balance is an integer and name is a string.
Yep. So I'm just going to do it like that. Instead, I actually think we may want to use a float instead of an integer, just because that will give us access to those decimal values. And yeah, I think obviously a lot of times we're not dealing with just even integers. But exactly, so a number, a float. Great. So a transaction, we said it belongs to an account. So what does that mean? What very important attribute will this have if it belongs to an account?
The account ID.
Yep. And what data type will that be?
Integer, or it wouldn't be a float for that.
Exactly, it's an integer. So this will be the ID of a specific account. Okay. So remember, a transaction is going to be, we're either adding or removing money from our account balance. So what else might we want in here?
Amount.
Yep, an amount. And we can stick with a float. So you could store these as integer. Integer wouldn't really work since we are going to want decimals. You could store them as strings, but I think if we're for an application where you're going to be making these transactions and adding and subtracting from numbers, it's easier to store them as numbers. So then you don't have to always be converting them from string to float. Okay, great. Some other things we could have in here, probably whether it's a deposit or a withdrawal. So we actually can't use the word type because that's a keyword. So we could call it something like kind. I don't know, that's not very, it's kind of weird, but I think that's what we're going to go with. So it would be a string probably. So I would say, is it a deposit? Is it a withdrawal?
Don't you need a date?
Okay, great. A date, that would be great. And we can do, I think that's date time data. We may have to do some Googling to get this, but there is a data type for a date that we will use there. Awesome. And maybe let's give it a description. Okay.
Date would be timestamp, right?
Yeah, I think so. When you look add it into your table, I think it's called date time.
Oh, okay.
I think
it can use date, but then you have to use to format it. You have to do that strift.
right. So that, yeah, this is something we can also play around with. We can see if we like the way it's saving the date. Because do we care about time? Do we only care about date? Just those are just decisions to be made. But yeah, for now we'll do date time and see how that looks. Okay, and then some sort of description. So these are our models, and we need to create tables in our database to hold our accounts and our transactions. So there are some ways to do this that make it a little bit faster for us. Does anyone remember any of those little shortcuts?
Does the Rails generate?
Yep, exactly. So the best option, I think, to use for this, since we're making an API, is to go with the resource generator. It will create our controllers and our models, but it will not create any views. So we don't need views. We're not using them. No need to make them. So, oops. From our command line, we can just run this. Rails G, you can do G or generate resource. The first thing you're going to give this is the name of the model. So let's start with account. And then you could just do this and it would generate the controller, the model, and the table for you. But we can also keep going and tell it that we want our table to have our account model to have a name attribute that will be a string, and a balance attribute that will be a float. And then we can just go ahead and add in this no test framework. So this will just say there's no need to build out specs for this, for what I'm creating right now. You don't need it. It's not going to cause a problem, but okay. So Rails G resource, we gave it our model name, and we gave it these attributes that we want in our table. So we can see here, created a migration called create accounts, created a model called account, created a controller called accounts controller, and set up in our routes resources for our accounts. So here's our table. It did all of this for us. So yeah, here's .t.timestamps. We could maybe use that for the date time. Again, we can play around with it. So this did this automatically for us, which is really nice. We also can see our model, account model, and our accounts controller. So we can do the same exact thing for our transaction. Let's see, resource transaction. So we said an account ID, integer, we said an amount is a float. We said a kind is a string. And date is date time. And a description is a string. Let's give this a go. Again, did this whole table for us, set up our model, and set up our controller, as well as our routes. Okay, so we're going to be coming back to our routes in a bit. We're going to have to make some changes there. But now we have our table set up and our models and our controllers, the files at least are set up. So what do we need to do inside our models? What are a couple things we can do inside of these?
Add the associations.
Exactly. So an account, what am I adding here?
Has many transactions.
Mm-hmm. And what do I need in here? In our transaction model.
Belongs to account.
Yep. Okay. Great. So what are other things that we could add into our models? For instance, what if someone submits a form for a new transaction, but they didn't put in an amount?
So you need validations.
Yep, exactly. So we can add validation in here just to make sure that we are not creating any instance of the transaction unless it has those values. So we can just do these regular active record validations. So we're validating, let's just say an amount. We can validate its presence. So you must have an amount. We can also do something like that in our account. Maybe we would want to validate both our name, our account must have a name, and a balance. So depending on your application, you may or may not need validations, and they just make it a little bit easier for us to make sure that we are getting the data that we require. Okay. So in here, another thing to think about is when we look at our schema, oops, we haven't run the migrations yet, so we don't have a schema yet. We can go ahead and run those. Remember, once you've run rake db migrate, you cannot go back to these files and just change something. You either have to create a new migration or drop the database. So you can just run rake db drop, and it would drop the database, but these files would still be here, so you could easily go in and change something. But don't forget that just making a change after you've run rake db migrate will not actually change your table. Okay, so now we have our schema. We can see what these tables are going to look like. So in our transaction, one of the things that we can do, one of the attributes that we have is a kind. Remember, this kind meant whether it's going to be a deposit or it's going to be a withdrawal. We only want our kind to be one of the two. So let's incorporate a validation that will make sure of that. So the question, do I suggest seed data for the project? That's going to be up to you. It's really going to depend what you're doing with your application. One thing I would recommend is if you're doing something like this where you're not using an external database at all, then make sure that your application works without seed data. So we'll get to that a bit more when we start making requests from our front end to our back end. But if your front end is rendering things that require data, that's going to be a bit tricky. You want to make sure that your front end application will still work whether or not you have seed data or not. So that's up to you. You can see that or not. Again, it's going to depend. If you had something where you already wanted a list of things when the user first uses your application, then you might want seed data. It's up to you. Okay. So we want to add some sort of validation that makes sure that the only two options for kind are either deposit or withdrawal. So where did my model go? Here it is. So right now we're validating amount that presence is true. So does anyone remember the validation to make sure that that one of our attributes is only has a certain value or two? It's okay if not. I have to look these up myself all the time, and that is a-okay. So we can do validates inclusion of. So we're saying I am validating that the value for my kind attribute includes is included in deposit or withdraw. So I'm saying when someone creates a new transaction and they give our kind attribute a value, that value must be included within this array. Okay. So we've gotten our models set up. They look good for now. Of course, you can always go back and make changes to these. You may need to, you may not need to. It just depends on what you decide to do with your application. So we also have our controllers that we're going to need to get set up. What we really want to do is add in here add a folder, API v1 folders. The reason is these controllers, what they're doing is handling our API. It's good to have this folder telling a user or someone who is using your application that that's what we're doing. V1 is also good because then you can easily, if you wanted to create a second version, you would just do a V2 folder. And you can then leave your existing version and just add a completely separate versions of your controllers that won't affect the previous version. So then we can move, I'm just going to rename these so that they're inside that folder. So this again is not, you can totally have this work without moving these in here. It's just really best practice to do it this way. Okay. So we move these into these folders. We also really want to incorporate some namespacing here. And that's also affects our routes. So get rid of you and get rid of you. All right. So right now in our routes, we have set up resources for transactions and accounts. What does this mean for as far as my fetch requests go? When I'm trying to access, let's say all transactions or all accounts from my React application. What URL, we make a fetch request with a URL. What would this URL look like right now when I make that request? Or what would it need to look like to get data from here?
It would need to go to localhost 3000, right?
Yep. So it'll be it'll be set up. The URL that we would be passing would have to be, oops, it's going to be running on localhost. You can always specify what, so what port you want to do. So if I do this, Rails S, and I specify a port, then my Rails application will be running on 3000, which means I will want to make my fetch request to localhost 3000. If I change this to 3002, same thing. I think usually the automatic one, if I don't specify a port, is going to be 3000. Yep, so localhost 3000. What if I wanted to get all transactions? What would I add on to here?
/ transactions.
Exactly. So again, this is fine, but we really do want to incorporate namespacing just so that it's clear we're fetching to an API and we're fetching to that version 1. So what we really want is for our fetch request to be coming in to this URL. So what do I need to do in here to make sure that the URL that I'm requesting can have this API /v1, and it will then access the correct controllers. It's probably been a while, but we can namespace these. So I'm saying, with just this, I'm now saying add in, so sorry, before it was fetching just 2 transactions. Now I'm saying namespace, so add in API before every route. If we want to add in the V1 as well, then we can further nest this namespace. And now we could make a request to this URL that we wanted. So the routes we set up in our Rails application are the routes that we will be making fetch requests to from our front end. Whatever we have set up in here has to match our fetch requests. So since we've namespaced this, when we make those fetch requests, we will need to have API /v1 before the rest of our path here. Okay. So we also want to namespace our controllers. We can do this just like this. So this controller is namespaced with API v1. I'm going to just do the same thing here. So again, if we did not include these folders and the namespacing, this would still work. This is really just convention. It's good to follow these standard protocol for setting up an API. Okay, cool. So let's go ahead. So we have 15 more minutes. So let's start getting these controllers set up. So when we think about our, oh, actually quickly before we do that, and I don't want to forget that in our gem file, we are going to want to add in this gem called rack cores. when we start making requests from our front end, we may run into a CORS issue, which is a cross-origin response something. I can't even remember what the S is. But when we're making requests from one server to another, sometimes we run into issues and it says that you're not allowed to make these requests. And the way to solve this is we can add this gem rack CORS. No install, great. And then we're going to want to come into this initializers folder inside our config folder. We see this cors.rb file. All we have to do really, uncomment this, and this origin will be the server that your front end application is running on. So, way to make this easy is you can give it a star, and you're saying any origin that makes a request to my API, I will allow any origin, and I will give back, they can access any of these methods from my controller. You could specify this, and it would be localhost 3001 or something. You could do that too, but just giving the star makes it a little bit easier. You don't have to worry about what server your front end is running on. So remember, when my back end, let's say we ran this, it's running on 3000. When I run the front end, it will be run with npm start. It will be running on a different server, probably localhost 3001. That's just usually how it will go if this is running on 3000. So they're running on those two separate servers. As we went over with these routes, when I make my fetch request to this Rails server, it's going to be whatever server it's running on, so localhost 3000, most likely. And then this is saying whatever server that request comes from, you can have access to my database. Any questions about that? CORS issues can be really frustrating. It's basically that gem just lets us get around those issues that we may run into. Okay. So we got that set up. Let's start. Let's actually add in some seed data just so that we can work with some things. So I'm going to split left. So now we can take a look at our tables while we create seed data. I'm just going to do this account equals. So we need to pass in a name and a balance. Let's just call it a checking account. Let's say we have $1,000. Okay, so I'm creating an account, and then let's create a transaction. I think it's good whether you do it in a seed file or from Rails console. I do think it's a good idea to play around with seed data. Whether you leave it into your application when you finish the project is up to you, but I think it's obviously good to check that everything is working as you expect it to, and that we're able to create new instances of our models. Okay, so we have to give it an account ID. We only have one account, so you can only really give it one. Amount 10. Kind. Okay, so let's start with deposit. And let's say date. I think we can say date.now. Is that going to work? Let's check. Yeah, maybe date.today. So again, these are things that you can kind of play around with. Here it is. Okay. Not, we're going to give it a try with date.today. And we're giving it a date and a description. Let's just say found $1. Okay, so we're depositing it. We gave it an account ID, an amount, a kind, a date, and a description. Okay, so I'm going to get rid of this. Let's try this. To check that our validation is working, let's just give it any other name, any other value. So remember that we said here, I only want the kind to be able to be a deposit and a withdrawal. Okay. So we set up an account. Let's run. Okay. So just ran rate DB seed. Now when we enter our Rails console, great. Calling account up first, we see that account, we see the balance, it's a float, we see when it was created at, and update that. So those were just T-dot timestamps. We could have gotten rid of that and we wouldn't have those values. It doesn't, it's up to you. Let's check out transaction dot first. We see our transaction, it has an account ID, an amount, deposit, great. Let's see transaction dot all. So we are only seeing that first transaction. Dot length, so it's 1. We have 1 transaction. And we can just test this again. Let's try and create this rollback transaction because the kind is not what we want. So let's try changing that to withdraw. Oops. Now we have 2 transactions, 1 withdrawal and 1 deposit. So it's definitely, I would highly recommend playing around with your backend, making sure that your data is being created as you think it would be with these certain values. A common thing to run into is that your backend is causing trouble, and it's hard to tell sometimes whether it's a front end issue or a back end issue. So it's definitely good to start knowing that your models, that you're able to create instances of them, and that they're saved in your database. It's good to check that first. So seed data or just playing around in the Rails console are both great ways to do that.
Annabelle, is there a way, like when you've added a bunch of seed data and you've played around and now it's just a whole bunch of garbage, to like delete it and start over?
So if we come back into here, so remember we had our account or our transaction. I think you can do transaction dot destroy all. Let's check. Yep, so that you can do name of your model dot destroy all. The one thing to remember is just because when you delete stuff in the database and then create a new something, so I got rid of all those transactions. If I now create this, notice that the ID is 3. So just because you cleared out your database doesn't mean you start again.
Is there a way to restart from your primary key, or it doesn't matter?
I think there are ways around. It doesn't really matter, but just remember, like if you're doing something like this, where I'm creating an account in my seed data with an ID 1, and I clear this, then we're going to have an issue there.
All right, so you should kind of destroy them all and then just start over.
Or what I always do is rake db drop. That's my favorite. And then when I run rake db migrate, it'll remigrate and rake db seed. And now when I come in here, we should see we're back to ID 1.
Okay, that's good. All right.
Yeah, rake db drop is really great because it drops everything that's in your database, as well as it also like resets those migration files, but leaves them there so you can easily edit it. Easy way to get more data in the seed. I mean, you could create an array of transactions and iterate through and create them all, but I mean, not really an easier way than this. But yeah, copying and paste obviously can, yeah. Okay. Yes, and Virginia, we can look at that again. So back to our name spacing. And yeah, thank you, Mika. Okay, and thank you, Daniel. So yeah, there might be some gems that make seeding easier. But you also, when you're just playing around with seeding, you don't need to create a million things to test that it's working. Okay, so in our routes, we namespaced like this. That tells us that when the URL for our that we're going to be making our request to is now namespaced with API/v1, and then followed by whatever these routes that we're going to will be. And with resources, we're saying we have access to all of those routes. And then in our controller, we set up this API folder with our v1 folder. And then each controller we namespaced with API v1. And once we start getting into the React side of this application, we can play around with this and take a look at how changing the routes and changing the namespacing will affect things. But this is the best practice to set it up this way. Okay, so we have 2 minutes left. So I think we might want to wrap it up here for today. Open any questions that anyone has right now would be a good time to ask them related to this. And obviously this is a live build, so we're going to keep doing this. Next week I'll have 2 more. I haven't posted those, but probably one at the beginning of the week, one in the middle towards the or end of week. And I'm going to commit all this code. Now that I think about it, I should have been doing more frequent commits throughout this, but I will commit the code, and I'll post the recordings once they load. Okay, so any questions? What we did, really all we did was set up our Rails application with Rails new. We set up the front end, but we are not doing anything. We haven't done anything there. We ran our migrations, set up our models and the foundation of our controllers using the resource generator. And we seeded some data just to test that what we set up is working. Any questions about any of this that we've done so far? No? Yep. Daniel said we might want to add a validation to ensure balance doesn't go below 0. Yes, so these are all things that we can totally add in, whether we do it here or set up some helper methods, totally. We can add those in, and we can see what we find important. We can always make changes to our back end just as we can our front end. if we realize something's not working. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for coming. I'm excited about working on this with all of you in the next couple of weeks. And again, I will post everything as soon as the recording is processed. And I hope to see you all in upcoming study groups. Have a good one. Bye.